Hello, welcome to the meeting tent, an informal discussion of the work of Stan Tenen. Before we get started, let me introduce our usual cast of characters: Michael Andron, Daniel Gill, Edel Packer, and Lavana Tenen. So this episode, we're going to pick up where we left off last week in viewing a video that's on our video website, meruvideo.com. It was a three-part series as a companion to the book, The Alphabet That Changed the World. This is episode 2, called Form Follows Function. And last week we talked about that. After we showed that portion of the video, Stan discussing inside and outside form follows function. We had a really good discussion on that. So we're going to pick up that. And interestingly, in the video, it kind of shifts to another discussion. It's related, but as you'll see, we're now going to get into how he developed the meanings of the letters. So let's watch that.
And so we end up with two columns, one representing the outside and the other the inside. We split the reality in those two categories, and then we analyze it. And if you start with the outside, and if you're trying to construct an alphabet, the first thing you have to do, if the letters are going to be meaningful, is to decide what meanings you have to represent. What are the primary elements? Now, it turns out that Arthur M. Young, the author of The Reflexive Universe and Geometry of Meaning, who was also the inventor of the rotor assembly for the Bell helicopter, as I recall, ran the Institute for the Study of Consciousness in Berkeley. And some of the Meru presentations were made there, along with presentations by other consciousness and physics and cutting-edge researchers in the 80s and 90s in Berkeley, in the San Francisco area. What Arthur did was to analyze what he called the geometry of meaning. There's 2 or 3 primary ideas. Actually, there are more than that, but they're 2 of the most important are the fourth cycles and the 7 cycle. Turns out if you try to map the system in 3D, it maps onto a torus, which has a 7-color map on it. So you have kind of 2 cycles of action. And the positions of the elements on this circles or cycles of action is what gives us a way to map meanings. But I noticed the comparison. And Arthur mapped these 7 stages of process, which was an idea that was very important to him. And since the alphabet consists in Hebrew of 27 letters, which is 3 levels of 9, I added 0, the whole in the middle, to 0, the whole of the process. So I go from the center whole through 7 stages of process to the whole of the torus. And so you have 9 steps in every cycle, and there's 3 levels. And I noticed that you could compare the meaning of the names of the letters to the stages that Arthur gives in his analytic form of this model. So I combined the 2, and that's what enabled me to make the little chart on the outline for the book on the right side, which tells us that there's a kind of symmetry. If Aleph represents everything in the first 9 letters, then the rest of the 9 letters, Tet, which means complete, is the opposite of everything. And you start with everything, you go through a cycle, you end up with everything. Beit then becomes the first distinction, the distinction between inside and outside, opening up. And Het, next to the last letter in the cycle, is a fenced field. It's a re-enclosure. Gimel is a camel. It means what a camel does. It goes back and forth between oases. Gimel is action between limits. And at the other end of the alphabet, before Het, is Zion. Zion is projection, a weapon, a spear to go attack outwardly. And after Aleph, Beit, and Gimel, there's Dalet, which means to divide. And on the other side, there's Vav, which means and it's a spine, and it means to multiply. And in the middle is Hey, to connect. So that if the cycle Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zion, Het, Tet can be read in a very compact way. And that gives us the organization for the meaning of each of the 3 levels of 9 letters that make up the 27-letter alphabet. So if we start with those names, those meanings, the next question is, how do we express them? And we realized eventually, quite late in the game, that the natural way to express something is to realize that in architecture and in design, in many fields, it's a very high principle which teaches that form follows function. The shape of a thing, when you represent it, should map onto what the concept means internally. And we also have an ambiguity because what's inside can be outside, what's outside can be inside. It's a matter of choice. And the light in the meeting tent model, and the vortex in the middle can be masculine because it's penetrating, and the tetrahedron, its companion, can be feminine because it's a vessel. Or the tetrahedron could be masculine because it's rigid, and the flame can be feminine because it's separable. Which is which? Well, they're both right. They're a duality. So you can't say for sure. You have to use the application and the polarity that's appropriate in the context. So that's why there's a little footnote that says, in some contexts, these are reversed. It's not significant, but you have to pay attention to it. Once we have the names of the letters, and then we have to express them. And it turns out our research came down to the idea that you express meaning by pointing to things, and that hand gestures are universal. Everybody knows that if you outline the shape of a basketball in front of you, it means round. And if you spell the Hebrew word for round, Gimel Lamed, your hands are forced to outline a basketball. And we've got some video and some drawings that show some of this. So we end up with putting together this natural process. We account for the stages in the entire life process, the embryonic process, by making gestures, and the gestures naturally express the form of the function they represent. And that's the main thrust of what we have. That makes it a universal alphabet.
All right. I mean, again, who does this? I mean, the connection, Stan obviously read The Reflexive Universe at a time where he was trying to work out these meanings and get some quality information from the alphabet, not only the alphabet, the order of the alphabet. So Levana, maybe you can tell us about Stan's relationship with Arthur Young, because I know they had a close relationship. When I came on the scene, he was talking about Arthur a lot. And we filmed not the first presentation, the second one at his institute called Matrix of Meaning. So tell us more about that.
Okay, well, as you can see from Stan's copy of The Reflexive Universe, he read it a lot. This is actually the first published edition. He came across The Reflexive Universe in the late 70s when it was first published. And then we realized that Young was giving hosting these lectures at his Institute for the Study of Consciousness in Berkeley. At the time, Stanley wasn't even considering the letter meanings so much. This was very, very early in the investigation. But the group of people who were centered around Arthur Young's place were there was a group of, I guess at the time we all called ourselves, it's like fringe physics or fringe math, and since then those people have, many of them have become much more well known in general circles. But anyway, Uh, Arthur hosted a lot of lectures on math, physics, ESP, um, basically research that was by people who were thinking outside of the box. And Stanley certainly fit into that category. Jung himself was, I guess, the best term to describe him, aside from being an inventor, which he certainly was, is as a mathematical philosopher. And he also was a very broad-based thinker. He was meticulous, but he had a lot of fields of interest. And I think that that was one of the places where he and Stanley resonated, because Stanley also saw relationships across various different fields. And in fact, that kind of thinking was part of Arthur's inspiration for looking for what he called a theory of process. How do things change? Is there a congruent process that everything goes through to get from this stage to that stage? And so the reflexive universe, and to a certain extent the geometry of meaning, but particularly the reflexive universe, is a presentation of that idea and the examples that he thought of. One little caution I will give to people who are familiar with our book, and there are a couple of pages where this is Stanley talking about Arthur Jung's sequence, and this is the same sequence that is dealt with on that poster that Bill just showed. Jung's starting point, since he's English American, goes left to right. The starting point for the work that we were doing, since we're dealing with the Hebrew letters, goes from right to left. So if anybody has been confused about that, those 2 pages in our book, 116 and 117, that's why. So starting in 1991, every couple of years, Stanley gave a presentation at Arthur's. The last one that he gave there, I think, was 1996 or 7, something like that. And it was pretty much the same audience all the way through. Arthur was a financial supporter of our work to a certain degree. And we would generally go over there, just speaking with him privately, 2 or 3 times a year. Arthur had a couple of walls full of slightly larger than 8.5 by 11 bound journals, without lines, just, the pages, meticulous little bitty handwriting that went back to his research and thoughts back into the 1920s.
Wow.
Yeah. And the Institute, he passed away in, well,
That'd be the late
the late 90s, I believe.
Yeah, late 90s, right.
Yeah. And since that time, the books are still being published I believe, under the auspices of Anodos Foundation. And his work is stored in various different places. Institute for the Study of Consciousness is closed, and certainly the scientific research scene in the San Francisco Bay Area has certainly changed in the last several decades. But his books are still available, and people who are curious and interested can go to arthurjung.com and find a lot of material of Arthur's own there. We were always grateful for the platform that he gave us to make these presentations, and met a whole lot of good people who were helpful at the time. So that's basically, if you've got questions about Arthur, I'll be happy to answer them.
It seems like this idea of mathematical philosophy.
Mhm.
I don't know if that still exists in the world we live in today, because this was prior. I mean, there was technology, but not to the extent that exists, today. But it's just curious how Stan, how do you even perceive the idea of trying, thousands of years of rabbinic material talking about the meanings of the letters, but not in this form and not in this structure, and also kind of a, hierarchy, I guess. The three stages of development, again, a very powerful idea. And you can see that he color coded it so that you could look vertically as well as horizontally, and they all had a relationship. And as far as I know, and maybe Michael, you can let us know because you've done quite a bit of research. Have you ever seen this kind of relationship of the Hebrew alphabet, in terms of the meanings in this sort of structure? I mean, I've never seen anything that parallels this.
Well, for the most part, people think of the alphabet, unless you're a Kabbalist gematria person, the Jewish mystical numerology, you tend to think of the alphabet as 22 letters, the alphabet as 22 letters. And that, of course, doesn't divide into three sets of 9. But the people who are looking deeper will tend to see 9, but 27 is, that was new to me. I was used to seeing 28. And in fact, there are 28 letters in that first verse, and the central line of the Kaddish is 28 letters, and 28 is koach, is power, which is really the beginning of the next cycle. I'd never seen anybody divide it up like that and then no less place it on a Rubik's Cube. But at the same time, when you are immersed in an idea, I think I've alluded to this before. You talk about Stan doing research. It's not like research where you're opening books and trying to find stuff. Okay, it's more focusing your attention on something to such an extent that a flash happens and you get it. The upper end of the sfirot, chachma, like you have the aleph, which would be keter, and then you have chachma, which is koach maz, that power of what? Of selflessness, of nullifying yourself. And they say that chachma is yesh me'ayin. It's something from nothing. Nothing being out there, no thing that we can, in other words, something divine. And that bina, it's mate, father and mother in the analogies, is yesh me'yesh, something from something. It's like Edison had the idea to make the light bulb, and then 99% perspiration is going through all of the failures until he got there. Clearly, books come into our lives, at least they have in mine, just when I need them. And you think, I have books that have sat on my shelf, and then one day I open it up and I just take a look at it. I haven't looked at this book in a while, and there's an answer to something that's triggered. It's like something from nothing. It just happens. In reading and talking with Stan, clearly those moments happened. where there's no logic. It's not like he was going to open a book and find it. It's not like the rabbis were thinking that way. They didn't have a Rubik's cube. They didn't see it. When you look at it from a distance, it almost looks like the periodic table of the energy elements of the universe, as it were. He had one of those moments. He was focusing on the flame in the tent, and he had a moment. Then he was focusing on the next stage of it, and he had a moment. And one thought that Arthur Young would have just kind of opened the floodgate. Because once you got that one thing, you could then talk about it for hours. But you got it in a flash. Like, oh, like your eyes were closed and suddenly they were opened. And that's the meditative process too. You try and get to that quiet place, nullifying self, and then boom, something happens. And feels like a big bang at the moment that it happens. Right. And I think that that's what it was. It's funny because when you guys talk about it and you say he didn't get it, and so he realized this was not it, and he put it aside and went to this. I don't think that happened. I think he had that. The flame in the tent was there. It wasn't like he left the flame in the tent there. He just asked a question. What have I got? What am I missing? But it doesn't even take that long to think it. And at that moment, some flash comes through and either a book falls off a shelf or, in a bookstore, and it's Arthur Young's Reflexive Universe. And it's a circle and then a bigger circle and a bigger circle. I don't think he ever lost the flame in the tent. I think it's still there at the core because he saw something very big. But his mind chose a direction. When he said what, it's not like me saying what or you saying what. If Dan were looking at that, his what might be thinking, how can I express that in music? What is that saying about music? He's not saying what's that saying about sacred geometry, because that's not his world. And that's a world we struggle to understand, unless you're one of those guys, in which case you say, music, what are you talking about? Or dance, or any expression of the truth that's out there. And he was on a search for that. And he kept asking what? And fortunately for all of us, because we have the record of his search, stuff happened.
Yeah. And what Lavana and I and Tad have been talking about, creating a digital library. And apparently there is a lot of notes and things that he discarded, and showing us in more detail a lot of the process in which this happened, and hopefully that's our goal, is to get that, so then we all have access to that. The other thing I just wanted to say real quick was, you brought up Bereshit, the first verse being 28 letters, and there was another statement that Stan made in regard to that, in that the first verse had 3 statements of 3, meaning that there was 27 letters plus the 27th letter of a 27-letter alphabet. And so that's on one of the videos, he talks about how that gave him the idea of the base 3, using base 3, and many other sources led him to using base 3. Yeah,
the simple answer to your question was,
there's a story behind that.
Okay.
Which is that this was in early stages of the research, where let's see, when did he first make this poster? Quite a long time ago, but anyway, at the time, it was also in the late 70s, and Stanley had occasion to be talking to, and he was basically trying to find if anyone could also see, decode whatever the pattern in the letters, quote unquote. That was as far as he had gotten. It was a sense that the first verse of Genesis, that the letters themselves were not letters, that they signified a pattern or a structure of some kind. And he had occasion to speak to the AV club at Lowell High School in San Francisco, which is the high school that was, particularly at the time, that was where the top kids in the AP classes and so on went. So these were the brightest kids there were. And so he was asking them, he was presenting them the pattern as he saw it, and in a way that didn't say that this was Hebrew letters. He, because he didn't want people to automatically think of the Bible or whatever. But he made the statement about, well, gee, there's 27 letters in basically the three statements of 27. And the kid said, well, why don't you try analyzing these things, giving them by giving them a numerical equivalent in base 3. In other words, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 2, 0, 0, 1, 0, blah, blah, blah. That's how you would actually write in digits in base 3. And so what he figured, as he put it, was there's no brighter people in the world and more open and curious people in the world than bright high school kids. And so he figured, okay, fine. I will number these letters in base 3 and see what that gives me. Well, okay, that obviously gives you a 3-layered structure, which we found out later actually is in the Kabbalistic literature. That was something that Daniel got for us. And I was looking for my copy of Shefatal, and I couldn't find it real quick. Okay, good, got it.
So Daniel, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I can just show. I mean, I can show you. This is unbelievable. So yeah, so you have here Shefatal, and you have there. He's got 3 systems of 3 systems, and he has it broken up by the sphirot. So you have the upper 3 sphirot of the crown, wisdom, and bina, keter, chochma, bina, and then the middle, gedula, gevura, and tiferet. So chesed, gevura, and tiferet, love, I guess you could call it the strength and beauty. And then netzach, hod, yesod is the next level, which is so often terms victory, but it really means coordination. Like a coordinated giving is actually a good translation. Hod, which is splendor, and Yesod, which is the foundation, and then you have Malchut, which are the Ik Bechar Galash Damat, all those like put together of the different of going this way. So Malchut is actually the 9 levels of 3. But what's clear is these are like 3 levels of these 3 things, of these 27. And each one is different, and he has a different explanation for why each one, and they descend similar to what Stan is talking about in terms of their kind of, Stan goes from archetypal to spiritual to physical. He doesn't explain it that way. I haven't got to this chapter yet, but he does explain it, and it's a similar thing. And I also wanted to show the place, just in case anyone's wondering, where it's right a couple pages before that, where he describes I have it underlined there. He describes it on the underline. He describes the reciprocal spiral right there as the shape of the descent of light, the shape of the sphirot. And he says this triangle, this 3-sided thing, this 3ness. It descends in its extension and gets smaller and smaller as it descends. and the more it descends, the more it gets small. So it's, you know, that's exactly, I mean, that's the basically in a way that's a description, that's the spiral. It's almost exactly, and it's, to me, it's like, you know, I mean, if I was in charge of the New York Times, this would be the front page, like, you know.
You should explain who the author is, how old the book is, yada yada.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. So the Shefetal, Rabbi Shabtai Shaftal Horowitz, he put his name as he named the book after himself. He was a very interesting person. He was in the 16th century, and he was the great considered one if not the greatest doctor, medical doctor in all of Europe, and he was kind of cutting edge in trying to figure out how our bodies work. He's considered, this is this is an interesting thing. This is one of the most often reprinted books in Jewish history, the Shefetal. The thing is, it was extremely popular before the Holocaust because it's a gentle and very kind of universal way into learning Kabbalah. And there's not much more to say. It was just, everyone loved this book, and it was read. As a matter of fact, many of the ideas that are mentioned in the Tanya are first mentioned right here in Shefetal, preceding the Tanya by 300 years.
It was important to him, and that is where the idea of that's where he became interested in the concept of Shefetal simply as the translation of the words effulgence of dew, which is what that means.
Yeah.
And using that as a way to think about the inflow of, again, this is kind of a Kabbalistic idea, but it was one that Stanley also talks about in the book, the inflow of energy. In the book, he calls it negentropy, that sustains our reality, the constant inflow. As a person, Stanley was always interested in process, and that's another way of thinking about it. You know, the Hebrew letters as verbs and not nouns in terms of their meaning. Arthur Young's stages of process. The idea that, in fact, our universe is sustained moment to moment by this flow of negentropy, which later he became clear and said more clearly that in his perception, this was the flow of loving kindness, from wherever you want to imagine it, or from, you know, literally God knows where. He was very much inspired by what he knew and understood from the Shefetal, from that book. Did not have the opportunity, for many reasons, to go into it and study it utterly in depth with you, Daniel. And our lives, your life was busy, our life was busy, you know, but nonetheless, what he got from it was became as much a part of his thinking and creative process as the ideas that he really absorbed from Arthur Young's work became. I mean, it's important in terms of his process to remember that why you see some of Young's ideas reflected in a lot of his work is because he actually encountered Young and was interested in it, and his imagination was caught by it ahead of time. Just the idea of a cycle of process fit in very much with the way he saw the universe natively.
Adele, do you want to weigh in on this discussion?
Yeah, I just love being here and learning more and more about Stan's work just from listening to all of you. But there was something in the very beginning of that video where he was talking about Bet and how he said that this idea of this distinction of it meaning housing to make it a verb, like whether you're on the inside or the outside, was essential to the study of Torah, or it would enlighten everything that has to do with Torah, or everything that has to do with Torah is about that very bet. And so I just got such an aha about that as I was listening to him talk. And there are levels of meaning when you study Torah, right? So there's the Peshat, right? Just like what's there, the structure of the language, the verb, the words, the story that is being told. And that's kind of like the outside. And then as a student of Torah, I'm being asked to look inward, like there's more. So as you study people like Safat Emet and Rav Kook, you start to see like the metaphors are really all about looking into your own life and really the reflection of who are you and what are you learning from this story that just seems like it could be a children's story or it could be a recording of history. But when you read these mystics, they're looking at the inside. And so when he said that this was the essence, this bet was the essence, I just, like, I said, oh, all right, maybe you've all thought of this before, but this struck me as so meaningful. And I actually got one quote, the shape outside should map onto what the meaning is internally inside. And so that's true of the entire Torah, but it's also true of every letter. And that's kind of was my way in, was looking at the beauty of the shapes of the letters and the meaning of the letters, and then seeing that the gesture that literally showed the shape of the letter in Stan's eye when he turned his wrist in that particular way, that gesture was meaningful. And so this whole idea of form and function, I'm starting to see like what he had in mind was the function is the meaning, it's the inwardness, and the form is what you see at first on the outside. And it's a big study, and he created a big study, and he got, I was inspired to buy this book because it was meaningful. I've bought so many books that he found meaningful, and it's a little over my head, I'll admit it, but in it you could get the idea that Jung was interested in the spiritual and how to connect esoteric ideas, spiritual ideas with science, that they're not separated. And that's really how that little video concluded. Was really how Stan was saying, like, look at all of this. We can see that science is not separated from spirituality, and spirituality is not separated from science. And that's the gift to me. That's what I'm getting from it, and I'm excited by it.
Yeah, and by the way, we did talk a little bit about this last episode and when I played other portions of that video, we talked about the letter bait. So if you haven't watched that, go back and watch that past video where we talked more about inside, outside, and the significance of the letter bait. But now I want to play more of this video, and I'll just do it. I don't need an introduction, and then we'll talk about it.
There's more detail. We can follow the stages of the process in many different ways. We can count them out. We can use Arthur's process system, and we can also use the Platonic solids. And so I have a little drawing called the Laswa, which represents a seed that flowers, and it starts out as a seed pack. It opens to a line stem, to a leaf surface, to a bud volume, and then it becomes opens to a flower and produces new seed for the next cycle. And so we go through the process geometrically that parallels the emergence of the alphabet and the first verse of Genesis. And the book goes through details on each of these steps. The comparable process inside is the generation of the meaning of the geometry of all of this, what your hand is going to do and the shape of the hand. And it turns out that the shape of the hand is not a photorealistic hand, which is what the scholars have assumed for centuries. But if you combine a line and a circle, a 0 and a 1, as we show in the book, and as it turns out, it's the way Yehuda Halevi describes the form that makes the letters. He says that the letters come from a device which generates the letters in a meaningful way. And the word he uses for device, which now means just any device, at that time could be read letter by letter. And that the word is inyan, and it's ayin nun, yud nun. Ayin is a circle, nun is a connection, yud is a point, and final nun is an infinite line. If you put them all together, you get a reciprocal spiral to the mathematicians. You get a circle line. Also, the wind-up and pitch form is a natural unfoldment of that sort. And so they couldn't launch a rocket and see that the reentry trajectory followed the reciprocal spiral. But David could not knock it. Now, Goliath, by us, was a sling. And the flight of a sling, we rotate around to gain momentum and release the bolus, is the rough approximation to the same reciprocal spiral. And so that you get the shape from that. You put the shape together with the list of meanings. You express the meanings as gestures, and you have a natural universal language that anyone can understand. If you go from country to country, from city-state to city-state in the ancient world, you can talk to the natives by making universal gestures, and you can translate it into their language pretty easily also.
So we played the rest of that video on our last episode. So, we've had 2 episodes now where we've showed segments of this video, and I'm beginning to believe that this is the one that everybody should watch. It does, the reason I had to split it up because it maybe the structure goes a little sideways and then comes back, but in any case, it really tells the story. And how did you guys like my little David and Goliath video?
Very nice, very nice.
Great.
In any case, any comments on what we just saw? And we talked about Inyan before, Daniel. The device, Judah Halevi was a source. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, that was, I think I did a translation of that. That was important. Yeah, that was an important one. Then there's another important one I did, translation of Rav Moshe Cordovero's Pardes Rimonium. There's a part where it shows the hand model basically, but in kind of a 2D form. So I translated that as well. And Yehuda Halevi was, I think we live in such a compartmentalized time period where, it's not necessarily bad, it's just that's where we are. Everyone has their specialty and they do their thing and they're experts in their field. And one of the interesting things, if you go back in time, is that there were people who were compartmentalized. People, if someone made clothes, they made clothes, and that's all they did. And if someone was some other type of artisan or whatever, but there were thinkers, and especially in the Jewish world, and especially in the Spanish Jewish world, there were thinkers who just were, around the time of before the Renaissance, whatever. Actually, Yehuda Halevi's case, but big thinkers, global thinkers, Renaissance people, you would say, but he's before the Renaissance. But but it was, so they knew Yehuda Levi wrote poetry and music and love poetry, beautiful love poetry, and interesting, combined different love poems with different religious ideas, and was not excommunicated for it. Like just like and he understood mathematics, and he understood politics and rhetoric. He was a brilliant rhetorician, and so I think what's interesting is, I think in meeting Stan as his friend, I think he was really like a Renaissance person. Like he just had such a broad knowledge, such a broad interest in connecting fields. And I think he didn't, maybe it was frustrating, because he didn't see conflict where other people did. He saw connection, actually. And so I think in Yehuda Levi's Inyan, I think he looked at it probably in a way similar to Yehuda Levi would have looked at it. Yehuda Levi would have, I think, I think he intended it, but even if he didn't, he would have loved that someone looked at his work and saw a meaning there. I think it's tremendous. And I think that indeed, going back in the history of Hebrew, it's very likely that Inyan had a more specific meaning that's now become kind of a broader meaning. It's very, very plausible, actually.
But Stan didn't only take the idea of the Inyan, he broke down the word into the concept or 4 elements that describes the process.
Yeah.
Hey, Michael, who does that?
Well, Stan does.
Stan does.
And no question about it. The combination of 2 of things from Dan this morning struck me. First, looking at the Shefat Tal that he showed in the book, and then talking about this idea of being in boxes and him seeing outside the boxes to somebody else's box, peeking into the next guy's box. That was one of the most interesting conversations that I had with Stan, because the first time I had just started the book and didn't know what it was. And, he sent me to the end to read about the healing stuff, but I showed him on one occasion some slides that I used that I was discovering along the way, using something different. And I'd like to share them with you because it relates exactly to what you were both talking about here. No, next slide. Okay. Here's the Sfirot. And generally we can see 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and 1. Okay. This one, Da'at, is either used instead of this one. This is more personal, this is more universal, but it's either this 3 or this 3. These 3 stand for Chabad, which is the Lubavitch, but that's where the Tanya comes from. So you had 3 sets of 3, which is what Dan was showing in the Shefat Tal. In the Chinese martial arts and in Chinese philosophy, the Taiji Du, it's not Taiji like, the Taiji means supreme ultimate. This is like the way they looked at the world. And you had 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, whoop, and this extra one, okay? This one was making a point, but it wasn't part of the system. But it's exactly the same picture in a different culture completely. It had 3 sets of 3. And then the final grounding of it, which was the creation of all things. And this was the supreme ultimate reality, which is the Ein Sof. It's where it's starting and where it's ending. You go to yoga, and by the way, here there are 7 levels because 3 of them, there, and there are doubles because there's balance in thought, word, and action in terms of what those mean. Here too, you had 7 levels from top to the bottom in yoga. Here too, on a hillside or a mountainside in Nevada, you had similarly 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It was the same picture. And the way the olamot, the 4 worlds, are done, This picture was exactly the same as the Jewish version of the picture. They all saw something there. And it was the researcher that I worked with who he and Stan knew each other. When you look at a hydrogen atom and you look inside the proton, you have three sets of three quarks, inside of which there are three monopoles. This is string theory. And when you put them in a line, what have you got? You got the same picture. You have the same three, and three manifesting in every wisdom culture in the world. And each one taps into it wherever they are. That's where they tap into it. He tapped into it from his knowledge base. The Chef Fatal didn't have all of that stuff, but he came to the same reality. He understood that reality. String theory certainly didn't have the alphabet, but they got the same thing. And we can spend our time arguing who had it first, or simply realize that everybody had it. It was there. They just needed to open their inner eye to discover it and then pursue it. Now, with the world being smaller because of the internet, everybody has access to everybody else's pictures. I mean, here we are on this, and the people who are watching this just had a 60-second survey of Chinese, Vedic, physics, and Jewish mystical thought. And lo and behold, it's all the same thing. It's reality.
Yeah, it's based on reality. It's based on what
That's
actually
it.
exists. And these people somehow got beyond their cultural
Right.
boundaries or limitations to find it in different parts of the world. And maybe this was all happening at the same time and got recorded at different times. Who knows?
Yep.
Hard to know.
They all would have understood each other. The problem was that when their students said, "What did you see?" and they started explaining it, it had to be put into a language they could understand from their box. And as soon as that happened, it wasn't the original person seeing it. It was a guy 2-3 notches down. And then they were all arguing who had it, who was right, who was wrong, who was first, who was last. Instead of these guys, all of whom would have been sitting at the top of the mountain having tea and discussing reality.
That's right.
That would have been the perfect setup had it stopped there. But no, we had to build a Tower of Babel, and everybody had to speak a different language. And that's where it went.
Yeah, they had the time and the
yes.
which we don't have today.
Or the beyond time, let's put it that way.
Beyond
Yes,
time, yeah,
definitely.
that's right. They were travelers without question. We hope again, if we can get all of Stan's stuff in one place, digital, and then we can start cross-referencing and show the relationships to all these different ideas and cultures of the past. One thing it was very difficult to do, in terms of, and Daniel's bringing out a lot of references that, I didn't know, and it would have been a good presentation, for example, to a group of rabbis, for example, but it was hard to do that, using all the different elements that Stan had. Yeah, Adele.
Yeah, I was just thinking, in terms of what Michael said, that part of Stan's openness to discover was that he really saw what he was discovering as universal.
Mm-hmm.
And he saw the gestures as gestures that could be seen in any culture, and that would be a way that people would understand and communicate. And certainly all the dancers that worked with me from various cultures all found it meaningful, and that every exploration of every letter had so much universal philosophy and life yearning and all of the things that make us human, all the questions we all have in common, they were right there in the letters. So, and Stan never felt like it was somehow only belonged to Hebrew. Perhaps,
No.
perhaps these shadow lights could show the letters of the Arabic language, and that in fact the universality would be some source of peace if people could understand each other on a more basic level, the level of gesture. So,
Which is why I think that, I don't know if I would say you have the easier time, but Adele and Daniel, you're operating in a place that's nonverbal. The fights happen when it's verbal. When it comes out the mouth, that's when the problems occur. Prior to that, music and movement are so raw down to the essence of it that they can communicate that. As soon as you start explaining what you're doing, that's when you either lose people or get people to understand an idea. But maybe it was a simpler time and easier, but Stan is certainly one of the pioneers in this digital world, and even before it became the digital world that it is, who saw some connections. He talked about what you were just saying, Adele. He talked about the three Abrahamic religions, that if they could, get out of their boxes, they would see a connection. Now, was that the ultimate connection? Who knows? Okay, but it was a connection, and it made for moving toward a world of harmony.
Yeah, there's an interesting thing in terms of, I think Stan brings something essential to the Jewish conversation, which is that our specificity as Jews is in order to enable a universal conversation. And I think I've never met someone who's brought that out so beautifully and clearly. That's really the kind of kernel of where Judaism is supposed to be coming from.
And
on that day, the world will be one and his name one,
right.
Yeah, amen, yeah.
And it's all rote learning now. It's all just repeating these sayings without understanding what's behind it, without the experiential part of it. Right, Daniel?
Well, I actually said that to Stan one time. This is amazing. He really surprised me and he said, yeah, that's true. But he said, those people have a role also. He said, they're refreshing the RAM. He says, very important. He was such an amazing person. Like, he said, it's very important what the Haredim are doing. It's not like the ultimate, but it's important. They have to keep that knowledge base refreshed from generation to generation. And I was like, wow.
Without that, we couldn't be talking about this today without that.
Stuff wouldn't be here.
Yeah,
that's right. So you're right. It's kind of on hold, but it's being processed until hopefully we can get out there and others who are doing this kind of work and start building on that, before, because it is starting to dissipate. I feel, especially with younger generations, they're starting, because it's just being repeated over and over. And so I feel like what we're doing is bringing the depth of what this really is. And the fact that this is based on another form of language that does not currently exist, and communication. And so I feel like as we keep doing this, we're going to gather more interest in people who are already out there doing this or looking for something like this. I get a lot of responses for what we're doing here, thanking us for doing this. And people are all over the world in their own isolated groups and individuals understand this, and when they come across Stan's work, are blown away. I said, like we all, how this guy's really got it. So we're going to keep doing this, folks, and we hope that you're getting where we're going with this. And again, we're working on putting together a digital library to give access and make it a lot more cohesive and understanding in different levels.
Bill,
Yeah.
a quick shout out to the younger generation.
Mhm.
Okay, I want to defend them because this
I-
morning,
Those are hope.
before our session just now, I was in the healing circle that I have set up, the healing minion that I've set up. And a guy that I've been friends with, I was his teacher. I introduced him to yoga and healing and martial arts in the mid 70s. And I've known him all these years. He was at home, and his grandson, they're in Israel, his grandson was sitting in the room, who was a clone of his son, even though it was a nephew. It was like 2.0. I couldn't believe how much he looked like the kid that I knew then, who's now a parent. And he asked if he could stay there while we were doing the healing work. And I said, sure. And when we were done, he not only had done the meditation along with us, with very minimal preparation by his grandfather, who was sitting there with him, but when I said, anybody have any interesting experiences, his experience was matched with 2 or 3 other people who spoke after he did, who said, what he had said? I saw the same thing. And you could see the light in this kid. He's 12 and a half. Bar mitzvah is still a half a year away. But he was getting it. There are old souls also coming into the world. I agree with Dan. There's an awful lot of people, and what his discussion with Stan, there's a lot of people out there who are just repeating. That's okay. But there's also a new generation that's of old souls, I think, that are getting it.
That's right.
And if anything should inspire us to keep doing this, that's it. It's not so all the alta cockers can sit around and saying, oh yeah, I remember when I met Stan, he said this. Okay. It's for that generation that's going to hear it and carry it forward. So
Right.
I just wanted one shout out for the younger generation.
Yes,
They're not all millennials. They're not all on TikTok.
One of our big supporters, Tad, who has not appeared with us and is very close to the project. We've talked about that over the years, that our audience is that newer generation who are curious. Usually the term is spiritual but not religious. And it's not only within Judaism, it's within a lot of religions. So those are the people that we're really going to be we are reaching out to. But we've gone over our time limit, and once again,
Still.
and so again, another really lively, spirited discussion, and we're going to keep it going, folks. And so thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Take care.